Good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you in the audience, as well as to those of you on Zoom. My name is Michael Jacobson. I'm a sociology professor here at the Graduate Center, as well as the director of the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance, ISLG, here at CUNY. This evening's event is co-sponsored by the Graduate Center's Office of Public Programs and the ISLG. The Graduate Center, as many of you might know, is the primary doctorate granting school at the City University of New York, the largest urban public university in the United States. We offer 49 doctoral and master's programs, everything from anthropology and astrophysics to urban education, and of course, most importantly, sociology. We prepare scholars of all backgrounds to generate new knowledge and seek innovative solutions to pressing global as well as local issues. We also encourage our scholars to share their knowledge with the public. That is, to not only become scholars and intellectuals, but public intellectuals. And that is a core value here at the Graduate Center. That's why we're committed to hosting conversations like tonight's on topics that are timely and top of mind. Continuing that theme, the Institute for State and Local Governance is a research, policy, and technical assistance organization that partners with state and city governments in New York and around the country. We help governments with reforming how they deliver and pay for essential services, including issues of criminal justice reform, housing, transportation, scaling up evidence-based practices, and training current and future leaders, all with an eye toward improving the lives of the people who live in those cities and states, increasing justice, fairness, and efficiency. It's my pleasure now to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel, Jeremy Travis. Jeremy is a senior fellow at ISLG who has been thinking about, writing, and working on issues of criminal justice reform for many decades, whether in his role as the president of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the vice president for criminal justice at Arnold Ventures, one of the largest criminal justice funders in the country, as head of the National Institute of Justice, or as a deputy police commissioner at the NYPD. Jeremy has a great historical, national, and local perspective on policing and public safety, and I'll turn it over to him now to get us going.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. Although the many decades part of the introduction just took my breath away. For a long time, I think is better. I'm delighted to see all of you here tonight and want to first offer our thanks to the Graduate Center and to our colleague Karen Sanders for helping to set up tonight's event, and to thank our ISLG colleague Carla Sinclair for making it all happen. So we are living in times that are very important from a perspective of the role of law enforcement. So as New Yorkers, we need only recall the controversies that have roiled in our city, like stop and frisk, broken windows policing, the campaign to defund the police, proposals for civilian oversight, and others, to recognize that these are hot topics. But today there's a new urgency to this discussion. Debates about the role of law enforcement now include the role of ICE, CBP, as these officers carry out the Trump administration's campaign of mass deportation in ways many would consider unconstitutional, inhumane, and reckless. So our goal this evening is not to focus on those issues, nor to try to systematically unpack the issues facing the NYPD. Rather, we want to look at the role of the police through a distinctive lens, through the lens of everyday encounters between the police and the public. These retail encounters, these interactions, are arguably critical to the process of creating trust and respect for the police and, in fact, for the role of government itself. So how are these interactions handled by the police? Can they be improved? Which issues should be handled by an entity other than the police? And now we're at a time of a new mayoral administration in our city. So answers to these questions and having this debate, we hope, might signal some new discussion about the critical relationship between police and public as we enter a new mayoral term. So we are joined today by a stellar, and I mean stellar, panel of experts who represent a wide variety of perspectives. We'll hear first from Tracey Meares, the Walton, Hale, Hamilton Professor of Law at Yale Law School and founding director of the Justice Collaboratory. Professor Meares has made important scholarly contributions to understanding the relationship between citizens and communities and the police. She's been directly engaged in efforts to reform the police as a member of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. We were also fortunate to be joined by Brandon del Pozo, who had a distinguished career in policing here in New York, first rising to be the commanding officer of the 6th Precinct in Greenwich Village, and then as chief of police in Burlington, Vermont. Along the way, and I'm not sure how he did this, but he completed his doctoral studies here at the Graduate Center in philosophy. Dr. Del Pozo joined the faculty of Brown University, where he's researching public health and public safety responses to the opioid overdose crisis. We're joined by another superstar, Ayesha Delany-Brumsey. Dr. Delany-Brumsey is a nationally recognized expert on the intersection of behavioral health and the justice system. After completing her doctoral studies in psychology at UCLA, she came to New York and worked for this sort of the trifecta, for the Vera Institute of Justice, Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, Council of State Governments, and Fountain House. And Dr. Delany-Brumsey now is the director of community-based services at the Health and Hospitals Corporation, overseeing, among others, the Be Heard program, which provides a health-first response to New Yorkers in crisis. And finally, we welcome my colleague at ISLG, Dr. Kathleen Doherty, who earned her Ph.D. in political science at the University of Virginia. After an academic career, Dr. Doherty joined ISLG as a research project director, where her portfolio includes projects focusing on public safety, policing, alternatives to the police, and most importantly, she has conducted groundbreaking research in the stop and frisk practices of the NYPD, commissioned by the federal court overseeing the consent decree in Floyd versus NYPD. So this is a stellar panel. I'm delighted that they've come together to help us unpack these issues tonight. We're going to have a panel discussion, after which, around 7:30 or so, we'll open it up for questions, so please get prepared for your questions and come up to one of these two mics. What do you say? Let's get started. Tracey has conducted really important scholarly research on the interaction between police and public, often through the lens of procedural justice, around issues like legitimacy, a big topic. So we're going to ask her, and then Brandon, another theorist on the panel, to talk about why this issue is important. So Brandon's doctoral dissertation, completed here at the Graduate Center, he turned into a book. Just catch this title: The Police and the State: Security, Social Cooperation, and the Public Good. So he clearly belongs on this panel tonight. So we'd like each of you to take 5 minutes or so to just talk about why this issue at some high level is important in governance, in our democracy, and in the role of the police in our society. Starting with you, Tracey.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. It's really great to see you. I'm going to try in about 5 minutes to explain exactly why people are so focused on the idea of trust in the police. And I think a lot of that comes from about 20 years of research where we've actually changed the conversation. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go back to the mid-90s, people thought that the way we ought to evaluate police was whether they were effective at reducing crime. And starting in the early to mid-aughts, violent crime actually started trending downward. And so if the way people evaluated the effectiveness of police, or how they actually thought that police were doing well at their jobs, you can imagine a graph, right? Violent crime is going like this, and if we were going to put a graph of people's assessments of police, we should see it going like this. But we didn't see that. What we saw was that the assessment of police remained flat. And so my colleague and co-author, co-founder at the Justice Collaboratory, Tom Tyler, thought this was odd. He wanted to try to explain it. And we thought, well, maybe people actually evaluate police on the basis of something else. So what is that? And the research that we've done has focused on the fact that positive perceptions of police are really tied to their perceptions of police legitimacy, which psychologists measure in a particular way. So when we use the term legitimacy, what we're talking about is the belief that people have that an authority, institution, or social arrangement is proper or just. Okay, and then that's really critical in governance. And the reason why it is because when people believe these institutions or agents are legitimate, they're more likely to engage with them, cooperate with them, and actually voluntarily follow rules and directives. So one way of thinking about legitimacy then is that it just means that control by others is replaced by self-control and internal motivation. Then the next question is, well, what contributes to these internal motivations? And there could be multiple paths. Deference to custom and values is one. Devotion to a charismatic leader is another. But those two things have nothing to do with trust. What does have to do with trust is this idea called procedural justice. And there's decades of research that shows that procedural justice is linked to legitimacy. What are those factors? Well, basically, one factor is whether a person believes that an authority can be expected to behave benevolently toward them in the future. That's one factor. Another factor is whether a person has an opportunity to tell their side of the story in an interaction with an authority, or actually have impact or input in a decision or policy or procedure. People also care a lot about whether decisions are based in fact, whether they are transparent, whether they are carried out in a very neutral way. Those are indicia of fairness. And people really care a lot about being treated with dignity and respect. All four of those factors comprise procedural justice. They're all pretty much equally important. Each and every one of them is important. You can't pick out one over the other. And if you were going to sort of bring it all together in one question, you would say, in their interactions with authorities, people want to believe that authorities believe that they count. And the only way they can make that assessment is by assessing how they're being treated, because we can't read minds. My children think that I can, but basically that's not true. Okay, so what does this thesis imply for policing, right? It turns out that this idea is really important signal for police, and it implies a few things. First, this process-based idea of legitimacy is not simply transactional, having to do with one person and their interaction with another person, because we can gain information from other people. And the reason why people care about this, I actually forgot this important line in my very hard to read notes, is the reason why they care about it, what authorities think about them, is because we care about being valued in society. And of course, it turns out that state authorities give us really important information about how much value we have as individuals and how much value our groups have, okay? So that's all I get to say, it turns out. But can I just add one more word? And that is that it's not transactional, it's group-based, and it's important over time.
Brandon, what's your perspective on this question of the importance of police?
Yeah, great. And I promise the second part of this will be like brass tacks and practical, but you're getting the theory up front. I also wanted to give a shout out to the Graduate Center, because there's no other place I can think of where you could get a world-class education, in my case, in political philosophy, while your professors patiently allowed you to complete that work while you're like working full time as a cop or something like that. I think it's a very special place. So the other part, the last time I spoke about this topic in particular in this building, it was literally defending my dissertation 6 years ago. So there is a little bit of PTSD, but the upside is now out as a book. So it had a little bit of legs. But the other part of it is I can say it from memory because I'm going to put myself back upstairs on the 6th floor. The police, I think. One of the things that interested me while I was a police officer and chief of police is literally how do we define in terms of political philosophy the role of the police. I know Tracey and I have literally had debates about this in Puerto Rico. She gave me a withering criticism, but I'm going to forge ahead anyway. I think one of the most important, I think there were 3 basic roles, and I think the tensions inherent to those roles teach us something about the present moment. The first role is protection and rescue, right? We expect the government to afford us situational and immediate protection and rescue. And you can see whether it's a person getting pushed onto the subway, even if the probability is small, or a person robbed at gunpoint in Midtown, people get very antsy when they're led to believe that the government is not performing that protection and rescue. One of the things that we expect is a policing function. Notice I don't say law enforcement. Law enforcement is just one thing that police do, but a policing function to afford that. Here's where the tension comes in. Number one, the best way to do this is preventatively, right, is upstream, is reallocating resources towards things that prevent robberies, that prevent people with mental health crises from pushing folks on the subway. But if we take the eyes off of that immediate emotional response and the politics around it, people you can see get very, very impatient with the promissory note of upstream prevention. Balancing that's important. The other thing is when the police endeavor to deliver this protection, they have to professionalize it. That involves a deference for human life. It involves parsimoniously using force. It doesn't just mean taking a license to use force and using it willy-nilly. The second thing police do in this account of their roles is they bring evidence and people to the magistrate about behaviors that the government thinks is important to regulate, right? That is the behaviors written in the police's case into the criminal law. They say, they are the eyes and ears, they are the sensory organ of the court. This person is alleged to have done this. We have an interest in regulating it, and here's the evidence, right? One of the things we're learning, though, is that although that power derives from the criminal law, that doesn't necessarily mean the criminal adjudication is the best societal response to it. You have this force out there in New York City, it's 30-something thousand officers, right? That are out there constantly mixing it up with the populace, getting called to things, doing things, sticking their noses in things. I've spent thousands of hours of my life just driving around Brooklyn trying to see what's going on, And then I would hurl people and evidence at the magistrate. What I realized on the backside of that is prosecution as usual, doesn't often have a deterrent effect, doesn't have, and is disruptive. So I think one of the tensions we're seeing that the new administration is trying to address, to deal with, is taking that legitimate need to regulate behavior, to have the government have a role in it, and not necessarily just saying by default it's going to be a criminal process, right? It could be a lot of things. It could be addiction treatment, mental health treatment, rehabilitation. It could be many things. But if we're going to have a policing function, we have to figure out what that back end is, and that second power of, you can call it the power of arrest, right? And the third, I think the most interesting, the thing I'm hoping is the most novel in the account I'm offering is the police broker and enforce the fair terms of social cooperation in public spaces. And if you want to know what really gets New Yorkers' goat, it's when they think that someone is really selfishly or uncooperatively or dominatingly using a public space like a subway, a sidewalk, a park, any sort of public space. And you can't just let the majority culture decide what the normative use should be. You can't just let the person who got there first decide. You can't just let the dominant religion or the wealthy class decide what that use of public space should be. Someone's got to adjudicate it. It should often be the police. The laws that do it are written as violations so they can enforce them with discretion, right? But they sometimes it comes down to enforcement. And I think that the present administration is under a lot of pressure to figure out, how do we cooperatively use public space in a way that affords that fair use in the instant without it being this biased or criminalized process. And the last thing I'll offer, I believe a key element of procedural justice is offering people reasons that they can view from a position of equality, because the police will say that they're following procedure exquisitely. When I make this drug arrest, I'm following procedure exquisitely. Formerly, when I made this marijuana arrest, it was done perfectly. When they arrested an African-American guy in a Starbucks in Rittenhouse Square for not buying anything, the Philadelphia police said, we're obeying every rule and procedure in the book. But the reasons that motivated those actions were reasons that citizens would say, that reason doesn't treat me as an equal citizen. And I don't abide by that. I think we have to get that right for police to be legitimate.
Thanks, Brandon. In setting up this panel, I had this sort of strange idea that somewhere in this lineup there's a joke. What would happen if a political scientist, a psychologist, a philosopher, and a law professor went into a bar? Look at this diversity of perspectives here. So our next two panelists are working on issues, I would say, closer to the ground. And we want to hear from them and just bring this down to earth. So Ayesha, your focus has been on people experiencing behavioral health issues. Kathleen, your focus has been on enforcement activities of the NYPD in the context of pedestrian stops, something that Brandon just referred to, as did Tracey. So how do you think about these interactions between police and public, and just to shine a light on some opportunities for improvement, not only in New York City, but just how should we think about this, again, at a sort of societal level?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, really excited to be here. Thank you so much. So I think a great deal about the question of how law enforcement interacts with the public, but from the perspective of, is there someone else who can step into that interaction, particularly when you're talking about 911 calls that are for people in behavioral health crisis, people experiencing acute psychiatric symptoms, people experiencing suicidality. So that's a lot of the bulk of my work. So I think a great deal about how do you build a trusting and effective response at that point in the 911 call that is looking to expand beyond having law enforcement be our only responder in that situation, which has been the case for a long time in most jurisdictions and was the case in New York City up until about 5-6 years ago at this point. And one of the things that I really wanted to touch base on is that I do think one thing that we often oversimplify when we think about bringing in a health response to the 911 system is that we correctly say that those calls should be responded to by health staff, by health professionals, behavioral health professionals. But I think we cannot simply assume that if we swap a law enforcement officer for a healthcare professional, that we are absolutely going to engender trust in the public, that that interaction is necessarily going to have a positive outcome. And I understood this relatively early on from like a kind of sense, understood perspective. I think about this a lot when I first told one of my close family members that I wanted to be a psychologist. He looked me dead in the eye and he said, "Oh, be careful, they will have you taking away people's kids." And that really stuck with me because I am extremely proud to be a psychologist. I work every day with psychologists and social workers and healthcare professionals who their main focus is how do I help this person in front of me? How do I help the entire system to respond better to people? But he was also naming something that was real. He was naming the fact that these systems, our social service system, our healthcare system, they have power to do things that are inhumane and to apply those powers inequitably. They have the power to take away children. They have the power to involuntarily treat you. They have the power to hold you against your will. All of those tools, I want to be clear, are tools that are sometimes necessary to protect and heal. But I also know, and what he was saying was that those are tools that have been applied inequitably and coercively. And so it's incumbent upon the healthcare system that if we want to change the way we are understood and experienced by communities, that we have to do a couple things. We absolutely first have to be earnest about the fact that we too are a system that has caused harm. And then we second have to build from that understanding a system that supports people from the moment of the call all the way through a continuum of supports. So I think that initial interaction is really important. I know it is. I've done most of my work in this space on that initial interaction. And when we improve that initial interaction, you can make some improvements to trust, like that. Those micro encounters can help some. but it's really about what happens after that interaction. Where are we able to take people after that? Can we improve the rest of the system they encounter, the hospitals, the outpatient clinics? And no surprise probably to anyone who's living in the world, but we have really significant gaps that are longstanding in our behavioral health system. Across the country, I could give you any number of stats, but if you're just pick up a newspaper, you'll see it, that people in behavioral health crisis wait for days in emergency departments for an inpatient hospitalization. They will wait in jails instead of hospitals. They'll wait for months for community-based care while they are actively suicidal. So I could keep going on, but the point is that if we that we can improve the point of that 911 call, that initial interaction, but if we don't improve the rest of the system, we're going to miss a great deal of the promise of what we can do. And this is not all doom and gloom. We do really see this happening in some places. I would say Arizona is one of my favorite places to talk about how their crisis system works. They built a coordinated system that starts at the point of the 911 crisis call, connects that to a mobile crisis team, connects that to a walk-in clinic, connects that to wraparound services. The system's built so that you don't get turned away at any one of those points. They minimize the use of coercion, and they're really focusing on what's the likelihood that you do not return to this system in the future. None of this happens overnight. I think one of the challenges for healthcare systems is that we're frequently asked to make massive changes that have taken decades to become entrenched and asked to make those changes happen overnight. But that doesn't mean it's impossible, and so that is where I see the real promise of improving those interactions.
Terrific. Thank you, Ayesha. So Kathleen, we turn next to you and focusing on a different type of police-public interaction and your thoughts and your research on that topic.
Yeah, I'm going to pivot a little bit from that and talk about street stops. And just to get everyone first on the sort of same page about what a stop is, because there can be a lot of different ideas about what it means and why it matters. So if an officer stops you, it is a brief detention where the officer is conducting an investigation, but you as the individual are not free to leave. So it is, you are not free. During a stop, an officer may question the person, but they can also frisk or pat the individual down, search the person or their property, use handcuffs if they determine it's necessary. Each use of authority that we're listing off here, like searches and frisks, all have their own legal justifications that officers have to do it legally. So that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about a stop. Stops are both common and consequential forms of police-public contact. Just to give you a sense of sort of the scale of these street stops in New York City today, in the recent years, NYPD officially reports around 25,000 street stops per year. The true number is actually substantially higher. We know that there's a lot of evidence that stops are significantly underreported. Beyond just the individual stops, the sort of effects of the stop actually ripple out quite a bit. When police stop somebody, they often engage with multiple people during the stop. So for every one person they're stopping, they're usually engaging another 2 to 3 people, so that are sort of part of the interaction. Obviously, so we're talking about street stops. Traffic stops are even much more pervasive in New York, and there is recent evidence of an increasing use of investigative techniques like a lot of pretextual stops and vehicle searches, an increased use of that. So why are stops sort of important in shaping the relationships between police and the communities that they serve? Stops are a tool for investigating crime and deterring crime, but they're also an important lens through which communities can form their views of the police, and by extension of government more generally. For a stop to be legitimate, it has to, at minimum, be legally justified, but legality alone isn't enough, and other factors shape how the community perceives police based on these interactions. So how officers communicate during a stop matters enormously, and there's a lot of research on this. Are they respectful? Do they explain the reason why they are stopping the person? These sort of procedural justice norms really shape how whether people walk away from the stop feeling that they have been treated fairly versus whether they feel they are subject to sort of arbitrary police action. And again, these interactions can sort of shape people's perception of police fairness and legitimacy, as well as their willingness to cooperate with the police moving forward. So in summary, how police conduct these kind of street stops is consequential, it matters. And again, this is because stops are common, and these incidents really do infringe on people's liberty temporarily. They detain them. They can involve further incursions like having officers' hands on your body, patting you down, going through your pockets, and even in a substantial number of cases, placing you in handcuffs while they conduct the stop. So, these are important places for police to sort of get it right if they want the public to perceive them as legitimate and fair in their engagements.
So you mentioned the number 25,000 as the reported stops. So New Yorkers will remember that it was a lot higher than that.
Yeah,
And
I
you
think
want
it
to
was
give us
about
that number?
685,000 roughly at its peak during the Bloomberg administration.
And what do we know about the racial dimensions of that police activity and age and gender?
It's obviously heavily tilted towards Black and Hispanic men, young men. In the current breakdown of stops, it's around 88 to 90% Black and Hispanic individuals being stopped.
Consequential in terms of their growing up experience and their relation to government and authority. So we want to, starting again with Tracey, just ask our panelists who have thought a lot about the question of, so where should we be headed, to think ahead for us. So Tracey, you've done some writing, and I've read it. It's brilliant stuff on what is called the police power, which is not just the police. Actually, Brandon sort of references as well, as a way of thinking about how safety can be produced in ways that involve but don't rely solely upon the police. So help us think broadly about how this all fits together.
Yeah, I love where Kathleen ended because it was sort of a bookend where I was talking about, and the idea that the interactions that people have with police, at this point I'm going to say uniformed, armed first responders, because that's really what we're talking about. Those interactions help them to have individuals to form perspective on all of government institutions, your office, Ayesha, the mayor's office, the state of New York, and so on. And this idea that I've been thinking about, actually, one of the audience members started helping me think about this quite some time ago, so I have to send you the paper, Sam. It is to understand that the police power, that the policing service, armed emergency first responders, are just one narrow aspect of the state's police power. This legal concept is much broader and deeper, and I'm going to read it because I never remember the words, but the police power is the power to prescribe regulation to preserve and promote the public safety, health, and morals, and to prohibit all things hurtful to the comfort and welfare of society. That is the power that the state, the city has to actually serve you as citizens. And we conflate that with the armed emergency first responders, and we expect those armed emergency first responders to do all the things that we want them to be doing. So this is a conversation that we were having. I think the difference that Brandon and I have is that a lot of the things that the city does under the police power is considered things that the city could do, maybe that they might want to do, whereas the armed emergency first responder is the only thing that the city understands it must do. And the way I think about the police power is actually that it's time, right, legally, for the state to articulate a mandate to carry out public safety, health, and morals, and to prohibit all things hurtful, which are not just private interactions, but the ways in which the state's excess is itself hurtful. And that's the way I think of moving forward, centering the work that your office is doing, Ayesha, centering the work that hopefully the Mayor's Office of Community Safety, however it's going to be articulated, does. And I think one place to start is to actually ask people what they want to feel safe. And you'll find, I think, that sure, they will talk about violent crime, but they will also talk about other things, like in the midst of a COVID pandemic, people want to have access to clean water, housing, and being safe, having, safely housed is actually a public safety issue, making sure that people are not food insecure. Once we start actually understanding and articulating how people understand what they need to be safe, I think it is then the job of the city and the state's government to come up with the bureaucratic arrangements to serve those needs. We need to stop asking people if they want more or less police, and we just need to start asking them, what does safety mean for you? And then try to serve those ends. That's a way of moving forward, in my view.
Great, thanks, Tracey. So Brandon, bring us back to Greenwich Village or Burlington, two jurisdictions you know well because you were in charge of the police function, narrowly defined, in those two communities. And help us understand what it means to think about the way that police officers every day carry out their functions. What does accountability look like? How does their interaction with the citizen get sort of factored into your thinking as the leader of these groups of people in terms of their deployment and their training and so just bring this all down to the day-to-day work of the police.
I'd be happy to, but I will take a detour. I love Tracey's comments, and if you think there's a philosophical antecedent to that, like Hale has this idea of the police that they should be doing everything from like inspecting firewood to lighting street lamps to doing all the crime stuff. And they did, and they were there. He aspired to this technocratic thing, and it wasn't just all armed first emergency 911 responders, right? The other thing, notice I said I don't use law enforcement, I use the term police because it's the policing function, and law enforcement is just one small aspect of that. But as far as and there's one other thing I wanted to say, it'll come to me at the very end, I'm out of time, but regarding Greenwich Village and Burlington, this is what I was going to say, and it is pertinent. If you look at the New York, I urge you all tonight, I'm giving homework, to go look at the New York City Charter that was ratified in 1963 that describes the police role. And the NYPD's charter could be word for word what Tracey qualitatively described as what the police ought to do, which shows, number one, the government was thinking about doing all of this and then went right ahead, even in the 60s, and ascribed it to the police rather than other actors. It says right there in the charter, guard the public health to the police. And then public health people hate to admit it, but there's a whole literature on the policing powers of public health. So I think we need to sort that out normatively to just get the right footing. One of the things I did in responding to the opioid crisis in Burlington was take a public health approach that really shaped my ensuing research career. I got out of the philosophy business, that I answered all the questions to my own satisfaction. Now let me go into biomedical research and addiction. And I bring this up because I had my narcotics officers do a search warrant where they arrested a mid-level drug dealer bringing in drugs from out of state. And there were a few people in the premise who normally would have been arrested. They were users, they were to buy drugs, they had some drugs on them. And the narcotics sergeant drove them to the syringe exchange, to the needle exchange, where we were able to go to a doctor into working there and just giving out medications for opioid use disorder, not just in a hospital or a clinic, but right there at the needle exchange where people who use drugs trust the police. And the sergeant said, I'm not arresting you. The warrant wasn't for you. It was for a dealer. And I'm not going to bring you to a cell. I'm going to try to get you some treatment if you want it. And I know you trust the people at the needle exchange more than me. So get out of the car and go there. The guy said to him, I never thought I'd live to see the day where a narcotics sergeant took me to my friends at the needle exchange rather than to jail. But to get to that point, we really had to build out the type of collaboration and back ends that folks on this panel are describing. I hired an epidemiologist to work in the police department to understand the epidemiology of what we were doing. I could say a lot more than 6 minutes about that. I also hired a 25-year social work executive to run the opioid policy for the police department and vet our outcomes, not only in terms of public safety, that was my role, but public health, right? And I put her office right next to mine on the executive row of the Burlington Police Department. It's not in some social workspace or some basement or, oh, you know, she didn't just get trotted out for press conferences. People had to walk past her office to get to mine. And that signaled that we were serious about this, this collaborative approach. And then every day we worked with defense attorneys, prosecutors, housing support people, the hospital, to look at an evidence-based approach to addiction and work it into everything we did. Cross spectrum, we realized, like, we weren't the ones that were going to solve a lot of these problems, but as police, but we had our tentacles and our relationships built with the people that were able to help solve those problems. I wrote a paper about it. It's now open access. We reduced overdose by 50% 2 years running in Burlington while we did this. It only went up after I left and COVID hit. But I will say in closing, one of the research projects that I found really fulfilling that is going to come to press in the next year is asking the Portuguese police about their experience with decriminalization. Because everybody talks about Portugal as a model. Everyone has an opinion about Portugal and decrim. No one has systematically asked the cops what it's been like to police a country where you haven't been able to charge someone with drug possession in 26 years. And one of the things that the police said was, well, two things. One, we realized that good drug treatment, I'm going to give you the executive summary. You'll have to take it as gospel. I have the proper qualitative data. But they said, we've come to view drug treatment as crime prevention. We've come to view drug treatment as public safety. If we can take somebody and get them on methadone, that's going to reduce crime and make our jobs easier. But it took decriminalization for them to realize that. The other thing they said is that although the relationship isn't perfect with the public, when a member of the public comes to them and says, you know, you're the local cop, my son is struggling with addiction, just know that. They're not afraid if the cop sees my son, he's going to lock him up and send him away to jail for drug possession. They know that in the worst case, the officer is going to refer them to a council where they can get access to treatment. And they say they really feel empowered to problem solve better in Portugal because they don't have the threat of arrest hanging over routine encounters because of addiction and drug possession.
Oh, I love both of these visions of a very different way of thinking and organizing our activities. So Ayesha, you have this national view of health first or community first, whatever terminology you want to use, responses as an alternative to, sometimes in concert with the police. So if you were to sort of look 5 to 10 years from now, what's the future of this in the same way that Brandon and Tracey are talking about a vision for where we could be?
Absolutely. So if I can speak into existence the future that I hope, I do hope it's a future in which we have built out health first responses, community responder programs that are embedded within 911, that are responding to people with health needs, but that they are part of a system that works from that call all the way to someone's recovery, so that the entire continuum of supports is built out and has the appropriate kind of coordination with law enforcement, because I think that the health system rightfully should always try to maintain ourselves as a separate system. We have to work towards being non-coercive all the time, as much as possible, but we're going to be, we are lying to ourselves if we think the people we're interacting with aren't interacting with law enforcement, and we're missing a opportunity to support the people that we care about. And so the nice thing is that I think the future could be closer than we think it is. We do see communities across the country, and we have some of these building blocks in New York City that are kind of building out that type of continuum of responses. I'll take us to Texas, which I don't feel like many New Yorkers always appreciate how much good stuff happens in Texas. So if you call 911 in Austin, Texas, they ask you, are you looking for police, fire, EMS, or mental health? And to my knowledge, that is the first place in the country where they ask that kind of distinction, and that distinction allows the Austin 911 Police Department and their partners in the health system to build out a much more nuanced set of responses. If you take it over to Houston, Texas, and they've been doing this, I remember the first time I heard about this, it must have been 2015. It's been a long time now. But Houston has embedded clinicians in their 911 call center. And they're often able to divert well over like 2,000 calls a year. They save over $1.7 million, but that's not the point really. Well, the point is those clinicians are able to resolve most of those calls on the phone. And then if they can't, they can decide, do they need to send a health first response? Is there some indication of weapons, so they might want to send a co-response with police and behavioral health together? That is the kind of work that we're seeing jurisdictions do. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say a little bit about New York City. I mean, you mentioned earlier about the BHERD program, Behavioral Health Emergency Assistance Response Division. I actually always have to look at the name because I can never remember the acronym. That's the intervention in New York City where we now send EMTs paired with social workers to 911 behavioral health calls for service. And in the first few years of that program, we were able to respond to well over 35,000 people. We were able to support about 40% of those folks in the community. We could provide care in their home, in their school, in their shelter, did not have to transport them to a hospital. And they said—
These were 911 calls?
These are 911 calls, yes, absolutely.
And how did 911 operators answer the phone in New York, just to make the contrast?
Oh, they do not ask about mental health. I actually don't know the script, I should know that.
I think it's where's your emergency?
Yes, where's your 911, where's your emergency, yes. And then they go through a series of questions after that to figure out if they can send us to the call, the BHERD team. But one of the things that's a real challenge in New York City for our team, for any of the teams, is that our system has these pockets of big holes in it. So you can improve that crisis response, but then after we've responded and you've supported someone, they've done well, where can you take them? If you're not taking them to a hospital, do you have a 24/7 crisis walk-in facility? Do you have a respite center? Can you help connect them to housing? And often the answer too often is no. And that means they're gonna come right back and we're gonna see them again. And you're just gonna have this cycle. So that's one of the major things that I would really like to see us work towards. The other piece is there's a whole host of calls that aren't behavioral health related that are 911 that we don't need to send. Don't need to send a social worker. Social workers are very specialized to do a particular thing. You might not need to send a police officer, and there are jurisdictions that are sending trained civilians, noise complaints, neighbor disputes, those types of calls that could be resolved in the community, but you don't need to use your law enforcement arm and you don't want to use your social workers, because I'll tell you what, there's not enough social workers out there. So that's really the vision that I would like to see. And I know people get impatient, but these kinds of programs are relatively new. The very first one started in 1984, a long time ago, but it wasn't until 2020 when any other programs started. So we've been seeing a proliferation of them across the country since then. There's probably about 150, give or take. And so we have to really more deeply invest in those programs, more deeply invest in the pieces of the system we already have. So.
Thank you. So, Kathleen, you can respond to, I know you're also looking at some of the things that Ayesha's talking about, and you have your own sort of research perspective on them. But I first met you when you talked about the thousands of hours of video evidence from body-worn cameras that you had assessed for the federal court to try to look at the stops being conducted by the NYPD. And I'd just like to take advantage of this opportunity to get your sense of what have you learned from that deep dive, unique in the country, into the actual policing of that tactic.
Yeah, we had a really unique opportunity to work with the monitor and to have a study that was ordered by the federal court. And it makes it, Jeremy gives me too much credit. We had a huge team of people that worked on this, but just to give you a really brief overview before I sort of talk about what we feel like we learned from the study. We led this really large systematic review of street stops conducted by the NYPD. In total, we looked at over 1,500 stops that involved police interacting with over 4,000 people. We also looked at another 600 low-level incidents that involved police interacting with over 1,000 people. We had an independent team of legal reviewers that were criminal court judges that reviewed body-worn camera as well as officer reports and radio dispatch exchanges to evaluate legal questions associated with police engagements with every individual. And so sort of from this and other recent work done by the Monitor and others, there's a few sort of key lessons we feel like can be gleaned about how to improve how police conduct stops. I think the first thing is just to recognize that unlawful stops, frisks, and searches are still a real and persistent problem. That officers still regularly stop people without sufficient legal justification, or they take actions during, even if the stop starts out legally, they take actions that they don't have the authority to take, such as going on to then frisk somebody without reasonable suspicion that they're armed and dangerous, or searching individuals without probable cause. We found that this sort of unlawful action during stops was particularly concentrated in certain areas, one of which is stops that are self-initiated by officers. So in New York, officers might stop somebody based on information that comes in through a 911 call for service. They might stop someone based on information from being approached by a person on the street. Or they may rely on their own observations of watching individuals as a justification for the stop. And it's these stops where they're taking the initiative based on their own observations that we're seeing the most legal issues, where either the stop is not justified, or even at a much higher rate, the frisks or the searches that they conduct as part of the stop are not justified. I think it's really important to note also that, well, as we said earlier, all street stops in New York are really highly concentrated among Black and Hispanic men. It is especially the case with self-initiated stops by officers. So in the study sample that we looked at, 97% of self-initiated stops were of Black and Hispanic men. So these, and these are the most problematic. So you can't even compare them with other groups because there's no one to compare them to. We also just want to note that their issues are also very concentrated when the city creates specialized units. So in New York, there were specialized units like the neighborhood safety teams that were created to target gun violence. And these units often engage in much more sort of proactive, self-initiated stop behavior, specifically to try to identify illegal weapons. But these, again, there are a lot more problems concentrated among stops conducted by these units, especially, a very high rate of illegal frisks. So that's sort of one, is just a recognition that even beyond the kinds of some of the issues that Tracey was talking about earlier about, how you talk to people, how you treat people, we have like a baseline issue of engaging people constitutionally. And if you're going to frisk people, doing it with the appropriate basis. So a second sort of lesson that we learned from looking at, from this research and from other work that's being done, is that officers actually do receive pretty substantial court-approved training in New York City on policing legally. And most people agree that the training is actually pretty good. And they get a lot of information, very detailed training on how to engage people legally. The problem we see much more is at the supervisory level. So frontline supervisors review stop reports. But they routinely fail to identify unlawful stops, searches, frisks. For example, in the data we looked at, less than 1% of stops did the supervisors think had a problem. So in addition, we're just finding that when you compare them, both in the study that we did and audits that have been conducted by the Monitor, supervisors that are reviewing stop reports and giving officers that kind of immediate feedback are just not identifying unlawful behavior. And so if you want officers to change how they behave, they need to be hearing it from their supervisors immediately. So they're not, again, receiving this kind of timely, meaningful feedback when their actions are improper. And to have things improve and have more constitutional policing, we need to make changes there. I will sort of note to sort of give the NYPD credit where credit is due. They have a quality assurance division, section rather it's called now, that does conduct audits, and they're much more effective at actually identifying unlawful behavior by officers. But they're pretty far removed, and they sort of rotate around the city in conducting audits and give feedback, but it's pretty far removed from frontline officers. And so again, just if we want things to improve, supervisors need to be able to identify when officers conduct improper stops. They need to be able to inform them, and they actually need to hold officers accountable if they repeatedly engage in unlawful behavior while stopping people. And then so, I know I'm probably hitting time, one more. Underreporting of stop behavior, frisk behavior, engaging in frisks and searches is a problem, and it undermines accountability. So any attempt to measure sort of the true scope of unlawful action and stops and hold officers accountable runs into this really foundational obstacle, which is many stops are not reported. So if a stop is not documented, it cannot be reviewed, it cannot be flagged, it cannot be used to hold anyone accountable. And it's a bigger structural problem in that, that has been documented for years now, that we know underreporting is a problem, and it has improved a little bit recently, but is still an important obstacle to overcome to sort of have more rigorous oversight and accountability.
Thank you. We promised a rich array of ideas and perspectives and challenging research findings, and I hope you think that we delivered. Final word, thanks again to the Graduate Center, thanks to the Institute for State and Local Governance, thanks to you for coming. This will all be on YouTube, of course, soon, and CUNY TV, so come on up if you have some questions, but thanks to our panel for a great discussion.